Good evening. What a fine group of people who have gathered this evening. It's such an honor to be gathered with such a cherished group. We'll ask those who are just coming in now to make their way upstairs, and we'll try to make that seating as comfortable as possible. And I know there are speakers there as well, so this should be good for all. My name is Cheryl Pauls, and I serve as president of Canadian Mennonite University. With honor, I welcome you to this face-to-face community conversation. Your presence with us tonight in this room and through live streaming signals a movement and a desire to be challenged and changed as we learn together. Thank you for entrusting yourself to this conversation and to a face-to-face format where we draw on speakers from different starting places. CMU, as a university rooted in the Anabaptist faith tradition, lives and learns in times and on lands entrusted by God to human creatures and indeed to all living things. And we commit to be good guests of the lands that have been known for long times as Turtle Island and as stewarded for centuries as the homelands of Anishinabek, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also the Métis Nation. We are grateful for the generous welcome of the Selkirk-Peguis Treaty in 1817, when this property where we are tonight was designated as river lots 18, 19, and 20. We're grateful also for the welcome of 1871, when Treaty 1 defined the terms of the covenant signed before Creator by Indigenous First Nations and by recent immigrant and settler peoples. We are grateful also for Treaty 3, the source of our good, clear, clean drinking water here in Winnipeg. The CMU learning community is committed to honoring our adoptive family relations through treaty, meaning the restoration and reconciliation with and for Indigenous peoples, as well as a call to steward the land and relationships well towards the flourishing of all creatures who will come long after us. Thanks for encouraging and keeping us honest in those commitments tonight. I now am pleased to call and welcome Dr. Wendy Craker, CMU Assistant Professor of Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies, to host this evening's conversation. And as Wendy comes up, I will offer gifts of tobacco to two guests who you will meet this evening, Dr. Niigaanwewidam Sinclair and Treaty Commissioner for Manitoba, Loretta Ross. Peace and grace be with all.
Let me add my welcome and good evening. You are obviously in the right place tonight. We are all in the right place tonight. Many of you here are familiar with CMU, and some of you are new to our community as well. Many people across Canada are joining us tonight via live streaming. We also have Elder Peter Atkinson and Colleen Littlejohn, both from Roseau River First Nation here as longtime partners with our out-of-town program. So welcome to all of you. The stories of Indigenous and Mennonite peoples are woven into the larger Canadian settlement tapestry, even as our experiences have been vastly different from each other. As John Ralston Saul asserts, a previous guest at this podium, he said, we need to rethink our history to learn how to express the reality of our history. I'm not talking about a passive projection of our past, but rather about us learning how to imagine ourselves differently. End of quote. The early 1870s witnessed agreements between the Government of Canada for both people groups. In 1871, as Cheryl said, Treaty 1 was signed between Canada and the Anishinabek and Swampy Cree of southern Manitoba, providing cession of land for Indigenous peoples in return for reserved land and it opened a basis of assimilation to enter into Canadian society. And we, as settlers, benefited from those treaties. A conversation for tonight. In July 1873, the Privilegium was signed between the government of Canada and Mennonites living in Russia with the offer of significant land reserves, freedom of religion, exemption from military service, and an opening for entry into Canadian society. Privilegium was seen and talked about by many as a fundamental God-willed guarantee, the first of any number of privilegia extended to other communities. My family arrived in the spring of 1876, only a few months before the Indian Act was signed, an act allowing the government to control most aspects of Aboriginal life: Indian status, land, resources, wills, education, and so on. We settled on what is often called the West Reserve, a term that I did not understand of its full impact and meaning till well into my life. So what legitimacy does our privilegium have without an awareness, an acknowledgement, and most importantly, continued fulfillment of the treaties that came before it? How does this privilegium impact our road to reconciliation? So tonight, we are joined by two friends of CMU, and all of us, as guests on River Lots 18, 19, and 20, are here to wonder, how might a conversation to better understand these agreements with Indigenous and Mennonite peoples in Manitoba open us to live together better? This is your opportunity to think here tonight honestly and collectively, and lodging this conversation as part of our reconciliation work. For this conversation, we have two wonderful presenters this evening, Sinclair and Hans Werner. They will each speak for 20 minutes, followed by questions from you folks, and you'll see the mic there waiting for you. But first, we will provide time for fuller introductions of our two guests, also by two guests of ours. First of all, Loretta Ross, who is our Manitoba Treaty Commissioner, first female Treaty Commissioner here in Manitoba. And Norman Mead is the very lucky father of this wonderful woman here today. Many of you know him as well. You know, we like to do lineages here in this community. So Loretta will introduce Niigaan, and then Conrad Stoesz, who is the archivist at our Mennonite Heritage Archives, will introduce Hans. So I'll call up Loretta first, and as she's coming forward, Niigaan of Hans, you can come and take your seats here, and then Conrad, you'll follow with the introduction for Hans.
Good evening. Nice to see everyone here on this getting blustery winter evening. I want to welcome you all here, and I want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory and the ancestral lands of the Anishinabek, Cree, Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Manitoba, as you know and as you've heard, is the ancestral lands of many other First Nations, which include the Oji Cree and the Dene peoples as well. So I want to acknowledge them this evening. I want to introduce Niigaan, and I should let you know that before we met at the coffee bar over there, and he was trying to twist my arm to trade places with him. And so I said you do it all. Yeah. And so I'm really looking forward to this. Certainly in my role as Treaty Commissioner, I've done my share of presentations over the time of my appointment, and I really look forward to listening to others, and certainly to learning from champions and people such as Niigaan. I've watched Niigaan from afar, develop his career, develop himself within the community, and he, like myself, come from a wonderful family. When I was just becoming a lawyer, I had the opportunity to work with, as he was then, Justice Murray Sinclair. And I learned a lot from him, so I can understand the wealth of knowledge that Niigaan has been exposed to, and how he's developed that and shared knowledge of his own. So it's wonderful to see him out there, and I think we need more people, younger people like him. I'm getting older already, so it's wonderful to see young people such as him out there, and I certainly admire him and am proud of him. And somewhere along the line, I do think we're cousins. So I'm going to claim him as my relative in any event. So I'm going to read the formal part of his bio, because I think there's some things in here that are certainly well worth mentioning. And if you're not aware of some of the articles and the books that he's written and authored, I encourage you to take a look at those. But he's an Anishinaabe. Whoa, Anishinabes, I'm Anishinaabe too. Is Anishinaabe and originally from St. Peter's or the Little Peguis Indian settlement near what we would know as Selkirk, Manitoba. He is a regular commentator on Indigenous issues, and I'm sure we've all heard him on CTV, CBC, APTN, and his critical and creative work can be found in books such as the Exile edition of Native Canadian fiction and drama, newspapers like The Guardian, and online with CBC Books, Canada Writes. He is also the co-editor of the award-winning Manitoba, Aboriginal Writings from the Land of Water, and Centering Anishinaabe Studies, Understanding the World Through Stories. He's currently at the University of Manitoba. Niigaan teaches courses in Indigenous literatures, cultures, histories, and politics, and is a proud Treaty 1 member. More recently, you can also read Niigaan's columns in the Winnipeg Free Press, and I encourage you to take a look at those and to follow him as I do. So this evening, I want to introduce Niigaan Sinclair.
Thanks. Oh, are you supposed to introduce now? Are you introducing Hans?
Yeah.
Oh, nice. 2 introductions in a row. There you go.
And then you're up.
I'm done.
Hi, welcome here. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hans Werner to you. Hans is a man with several identities and many talents. Hans was born in Saskatchewan to post-World War II immigrant parents. He grew up in southern Manitoba and completed an engineering degree at the University of Manitoba. After his marriage, he joined his wife's family farm near Winkler, Manitoba, and for the next 20 years, Hans was a farmer. Hans returned to the classroom to get a PhD in history in 2002. Until this past June, Hans was a history professor at the University of Winnipeg, where his research interests included Mennonite migration and settlement. And during the same time, Hans was the executive director of the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation. Hans is an author. He has written a number of books and articles on Mennonite migration, the history of Winkler, and a book about memory using his father's memoirs of being a soldier in both the Red Army and the German Army. Hans has served on a number of community organizations, including Winkler Credit Union, Red River Valley Mutual, Mennonite Church Manitoba, Canadian Mennonite University, and the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society. In addition to English, Hans speaks German, High German, and Low German. Thank you, Hans, for being willing to share your thoughts with us today.
All right. You guys so formal, eh? So formal. Come to CMU. U of M, I tell you, it's all just, you don't even get an introduction over there. They just throw you up on there. So, Bonjour Denwe Maganaduk. Hello, everybody. Niigaanwewidam Nijnakas Namagoshin Dodem. Niigaanwewidam Omayayan. Ganabach Mangikis and Agwajing. Gichinudin Agwajing. Bonjour Nimishomasak. Nokomasak. Nimiji Nibekwe. Mijana Gijik. It's a pleasure to be here and to share all of my different relatives with you. I just came from hearing my daughter in a debate competition at St. John's Ravenscourt. And we got there, and I'm kind of aware that the world is changing very quickly, but I didn't realize how quickly, because like I said, I arrived for my daughter's debate at St. John's Ravenscourt, which is already a pretty imposing building. We walk in, and my daughter and I, my little Anishinabek daughter and I, and they get all of the roles in the debate, like they do it parliamentary style, and my daughter gets her title, and it says Prime Minister. And I went, wow, the world really is changing. And so I'm trying to get over that here this evening. But it's a pleasure to be here this evening to share a little bit of the language with you and to talk a little bit about my favorite topic, treaty. But I want to acknowledge a few people in the room who are so much better versed on these things than I am. I just do a lot of talking, but I would just say, Loretta, you really should be up here because you are our representative about treaty. And I want to humbly offer you in the question and answer period to come up and offer some ideas and some questions if you have some. You're engaged with these issues on a daily basis, and I want to also recognize my Uncle Peter Atkinson at the back there, who is not only an incredible man and uncle, but he's also an incredible Medewan leader in our community, and I want to acknowledge him and his work. And I also want to offer you a chance to offer some words this evening if you'd like. I would be very happy to offer the microphone over to you. And many other people in this room too who I've worked with and I've lived with, and my family is never not been here. And those of you who know my father, my father is a bit of an uncle to the country. And he's spoken on this very stage, right? Is that right? And I remember I was on this stage a couple years ago with John, right? John Saul. And I know that CMU is an incredible, friend to many of us. My father is a bit of an uncle to all of us in that he's done this work. And walking in those footsteps is going to be very daunting. It reminds me, everyone sort of comes up and says, oh, these wonderful things about your dad, must be so hard to be, Justice Senator Sinclair's son. And I go, you all think he's about reconciliation, but you try getting grounded by him. There's no reconciliation then. There's nothing but a judge, jury, and executioner in that. There's no honorary witnesses. It's just right to the slammer. That's what But I come from a generation of approximately 35 to 45-year-olds, sometimes a little bit older, sometimes a little bit younger, who are taking this city, this community, this place, and changing it very rapidly. And there is a large segment of us, and I could name them all. I could name people like Jessica Dumas, who was just elected the president of the Chamber of Commerce of Winnipeg, first Indigenous president of the Chamber of Commerce. We could talk about people from all different walks, Tasha Spillett, Michael Champagne, and the list goes on and on and on, and these incredible leaders within our community that are all invested in conversations. We are so lucky in this place. And we are so lucky because of the people who have come before us that have opened this pathway built on a notion of treaty that allow us to be here this evening. So when I prayed at the beginning, I prayed for them. I prayed for all of our relatives out there, but our relatives even before that, our relatives in the non-human world who are really the only reason that we are here. The non-human beings are the most important members of treaty. They are truly the relatives that have opened up the space and adopted us when we showed up, whether they be Anishinaabe or the newcomers, the Wemetigojiwak, the French, or the Jaganashok, the British. And that when people came within this space and they began to join into a series of relationships, it was those non-human beings who joined with us and adopted us. So I want to honor all of those relatives out there, not just the animals and the fish and the birds, but also the water and the earth and the moon and the sun and the directions, because it is truly them who have set the groundwork of treaty. Humans are only the addendum to treaty. And what I mean by that is we came to the party at the very last moment of creation. Creation was happening. There were a set of treaties between different beings to share space, to trade gifts, to make life well beyond human beings. And the most important message I want to offer this evening is that at this time in which the United Nations has presented us with a dire prediction of 12 years until the world is radically changed in a catastrophic manner, if we raise another 0.5 degrees on an average global temperature, we are facing imminent disaster. And it is our non-human relatives who are speaking to us now. And if anyone has forgotten the notion of treaties, it has been all of us here tonight who will now spend this time reflecting upon what treaty really matters. What does it really mean? And ultimately, what does it mean? It doesn't mean a free pair of glasses, and certainly doesn't mean 99.9% of the land taken by the Canadian state and left 0.1% for First Nations to be held in trust for them, although that's a really important conversation. The treaty is ultimately on how all of us as relatives, as family, will live together into the future. Because it really doesn't matter how much all of us get along if we have nothing to drink, if we have nothing to eat. It really doesn't matter how many fights that we have over chief salaries. And that's not even really a fight. I want to read to you a piece about what treaty ultimately means. And of course, this is my opinion, and as I mentioned before, there's many people in the room who have different opinions on treaties. We have to get beyond the notion that treaties were about $5 a year, because that is not what treaties were about. That is how the Canadian state interpreted treaties to represent themselves. For Indigenous peoples, treaties mean so much more. And it is ultimately how people live together, how humans, non-human beings share space together, that makes a treaty, that defines a treaty, because our treaties begin in our first creation story. And this story explains a little bit of what that looks like. So this appeared from a great friend, a person who has done some incredible work in the Mennonite community, Steve Heinrichs, who edited and published this in an issue of G's magazine. This piece is called "A Treaty is a Gift." For Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, or Mikkalikimakinac according to our language, or North America, a treaty is a gift. It's an opportunity. Most of all, a treaty is a responsibility. Treaties are the eternal commitments made between two and often more self-determining and independent beings in the interest of producing life. If the promises are not kept, neither is the life produced from the arrangement. Without the gift of treaties, relationships fade, wither, and decay, eventually becoming forgotten and lost. When the treaty is forgotten, everyone is weaker as a result. In this way, treaties are the fabric of creation, binding all living things together in a vast and complete network of relationships. They're not perfect by any means, but they're intricate. They have intricate ties that must be visited and revisited, maintained and fortified, and can, with enough care and concern, become virtually indestructible. This is why treaties produce family. And that's important to know. Treaties produce family, not friends, because family is for life. And anyone tells you that you can pick and choose your friends, you don't pick and choose your family. Treaties can be traced back to the beginning of time. The first treaty was made when the first being met another, and when they decided to share space, time, and stories. It doesn't matter which story or which beings met, what culture you come from, or it could be the stars and the sun, or the earth and the water, or the bears and the fish, or even God and whatever. This meeting, whatever it might be, set forth a path that others would follow in that arrangement. Treaties can be written in the conventional sense or not. Treaties are not solely an Indigenous idea either, for beings all across the universe know about them too. Still, treaties are the template that Indigenous people follow in creating and maintaining relationships, for treaties are always about the future, never the past. And that's a quote from Jamie Wilson, the former treaty commissioner, who taught me about how important it is that we recognize that treaties are never really about the past. Not much has changed in the past 30,000 years on Turtle Island. Treaties are still this way today. For more, see any feast or ceremony or a young person singing in the street against omnibus legislations threatening water, earth, or life. Indigenous peoples still view treaties as life-producing vessels if cared for appropriately. For others, treaties are generally understood as a sale, kind of like a used car. One-time purchases where one side walks away from the other after the transaction, never to appear again. This is seen in phrases like, my ancestors didn't agree to anything, or why do you live in the past, or why don't we just rip those treaties up and start again, or my personal favorite, why should First Nations get everything for free? That's like a used car. That's like a used car sales, where you never have a relationship with the person that you presumably purchased off of something. There was no purchase. Indigenous peoples, like all Canadians, get nothing for free. We have all agreed to participate in mutually beneficial partnerships called treaties. As set out in these arrangements, Canadians were to get access to some of the richest resources in the world, while Indigenous communities continue their lives in bountiful and independent ways. And treaties haven't ended. In fact, they're happening right now. They're dynamic, changing, legally binding documents with members who carry responsibilities to ensure that both sides grow and benefit, quote, for as long as the grass grows, end quote. So without treaties, there'd be no houses, no water, no sewer hookups, no universities, no Canada. Everything around us is due to them. But unfortunately, things haven't really worked out that way. Treaty rights are constantly minimized by the federal government, and promises are almost never fulfilled, or fulfilled in such a way to be complete, to be inclusive, to be about equity. Land and resources have not been shared appropriately. There's more violence perpetrated against Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous women and children, than any other group. While Canada has become one of the richest countries in the world, Indigenous peoples have received inadequate housing, tainted water, inappropriate funding caps due to education particularly, which all indicates that the relationship is not working. It's one that's exploitative, it's based on control, and ultimately isn't about a vision of family at all. It's about a vision of a used car sale. The problem is, it was never supposed to be this way. The Canada of today is a fairly weak shell made up of fragile, broken, and unfulfilled relationships where almost everybody's losing, and it's evident within the UN report. Today is not the opportunity of yesterday, but it's not too late. We still have the treaties here. We still have the opportunity to produce life. We can still live according to the gifts that creation has given us, if we live according to the ways that we had agreed to live in the first place, together, looking towards the future in treaty as family. And that message, this piece that I've written, is predominantly to remind not just myself and not just my family, but all of us that we are all in this together. And what it means to be all in this together is that when we live in a community in which constantly we're arguing for a relevancy of a relationship, and a relationship not based on power and domination, but a relationship based on family and equality, no one would want to be in a family that is abusive. No one would want to be in a family in which someone was locked in the bathroom forever. No one would want to be in a family in which one or two members of that family were constantly belittled and abused, thought as secondary citizens, locked in the bathroom till 1961, then finally allowed to come out, and then told, why don't you just get over it? Why don't you just, why do you keep wanting everything for free? How much more money do I have to pay for you? Nobody would want to be in a family like that, but constantly and continually, we are faced with that reality, that there is a very small segment, but very vocal segment, mostly on Twitter, who are very vocal on the vision of what it takes to make a relationship within Canada, and have forgotten the very documents that make us who we are. And at times, it is the responsibility of all of us to have courage, to be truly Treaty 1 citizens, to embody a notion of family, and to stand up to that. And some of us may do that in other ways. We may do that. I have a group of wonderful, I call them warrior women, who come to some of my workshops, and they say, you know where our work is? It's in the Tim Hortons. We're bravest there. And sometimes it's having that conversation in that space. Sometimes it's having a moment where you write a piece, or you stand up against what you perceive to be an unequal relationship. And sometimes it's helping a friend out. Sometimes it's driving out to a small town in Manitoba who says egregiously inappropriate things about Indigenous peoples, calling them terrorists, but is living in the name of the town of the lieutenant governor that negotiated the very treaty for him to be there. And sometimes you take him a gift. You don't take them a gift of a punch, but you take them the gift of a cup of coffee and a donut, the language maybe he'll understand. And that's what being in relationship is truly all about. That's what being in family is all about. That is how a relationship is built, a relationship built based on kindness, equality, but most importantly of togetherness, of commitment to one another. And some of that stuff is hard at times to hear because it involves facing a lot of realities that many of us have been taught as truths for many, many long time. Some of that truth has been that Indigenous peoples came from savage and inferior civilizations, and Canadians' job were to get them out of those realms of savagery. But that is only one story. The other story is of a relationship in which Indigenous peoples invited others into a family that was already in existence even before Indigenous peoples even got here. And embodied by the Selkirk Treaty of 1817, which is the very reason that we are here tonight, Peguis turned to Selkirk and said, if you're going to be here forever, you must every year bring a gift. And that gift is embodied by a sema, or tobacco, or the language in which we understand relationships to be built. Because the teaching of tobacco is not one that is about earning or growing, not just about those things, but it's also about the work that it takes to become a good, responsible family member. Because it takes an incredible amount of effort to grow tobacco. And Peguis turned to Selkirk and said, every year you must bring me 100 pounds of it. And that will make your presence here complete. You will always have a home here. And most importantly, you will always have a family that will care for you, that will walk alongside you, and will make sure that you never go cold, you never go hungry, you never get sick. And in the end of the day, isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we all want, is we want to not be alone? And Selkirk, the first time, offered that 100 pounds of tobacco and never came back. He never came back. And for years, Peguis wondered, would Selkirk ever come back? The great Silver Chief even wrote a letter all the way to the king and said, is the great Silver Chief ever going to come back? I am waiting, I am waiting, I am waiting. For many of us in this community, with perhaps a smaller segment that aren't here tonight to have this brave conversation, we all ask, are we ready? We are waiting. We are ready. And are we ready to have those conversations, to be brave and to be courageous and to be together forever as the treaties intended us to do? With that, I say miigwech, and thank you very much for your time. And I hand it over to the brilliant Hans over here. I was almost said hands over there. Hans. So there you go, Hans.
Thank you, Niigaan. And just so you know, not all of these people are my relatives.
You didn't invite them all?
There are some, though. So thank you for that. So what I want to do is I want to also tell you a little story. I want to tell you the story of the Mennonite Privilegium. And then I want to offer a few reflections. So first kind of comes the story and then some reflections. So Mennonites migrated to the Russian Empire from Prussia at the turn of the 18th century. They moved because the privilege to not serve in the armies of the king was threatened, and they saw an opportunity to acquire land. Mennonites from the Russian Empire migrated to the prairies of Canada some 80 years later because the privilege of not serving in the Tsar's armies was being threatened, and because they could acquire land. Negotiating privileges with a ruler has a long history among Mennonites, and most often Mennonites offered economic benefit in exchange for the right to practice their faith and to live separate from the world. As an agricultural people, economic benefit, the economic benefit our people offered rulers and states often came from exploiting agricultural land for economic benefit. Mennonites have been good farmers. Farming is based on land. So Mennonite settlement in Manitoba began in 1873 when a group of Mennonite and Hutterite delegates from Russia and Prussia toured southern Manitoba. The sketchy sources we have about their coming into contact with Indigenous people suggest a varied response to what they saw and experienced. The Hutterite Paul Cheddar thought the Indigenous people that he saw were, quote, lazy farmers of mixed Indian blood and are more cattlemen than agriculturalists. But he did think the land does not seem bad. Wilhelm Evert, the delegate from Prussia, was more direct, and I quote him here. The Indians, gaily decorated according to their rank and present for business here by the hundreds, are not attractive neighbors. Although otherwise harmless, there is no limit to an Indian's thirst for revenge if he feels cheated somehow. Several times they have already rebelled against the government, and while the latest was ineffectual, they have been promised things which it is doubtful can be kept. Hence, those able to look into the future have already, for this reason alone, in many instances, decided to return to the United States. The delegates had come up from Duluth, from the southern states, into Manitoba, and some of them had now left early because they didn't find it promising. Some of the other sources suggest that in some cases delegates were grateful for the hospitality extended to them by Indigenous people. In other cases, they were critical of their punctuality and their use of alcohol. I do not believe there are any reflections of their sense of ownership of the land or, quote, its emptiness, in quotation marks. One would think they would have been curious about that question, and they may have been, and may have been assured that things had been looked after by treaties, obviously. The delegates of two of the subgroups represented subsequently traveled to Ottawa, where they negotiated a series of promises that were outlined firstly in a letter to the delegates from John Lowe. And that letter Conrad has graciously brought us. It's been recently restored, and it is the original letter, the original Lowe letter. So initially, this was outlined in a series of promises in that letter, written by John Lowe, the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, and then embodied in a Privy Council order, an order of cabinet, Privy Council Order 957, which enshrined these privileges into law. So you can have a look at the original there afterwards. Briefly, these privileges were the following. Freedom from military service, an important point for a group who believed that the Christian ought not to participate in violence, particularly not violence in war. 8 townships for, quote, exclusive use of the Mennonite settlers under the terms of the Dominion Lands Act. 3, the, quote, the fullest privilege to exercise their religious principles and educating their children in schools as provided by law in the Privy Council order without any kind of molestation or restriction whatsoever. 4, the privilege of affirming rather than taking the oath. Mennonites did not believe that they should put their hand on the Bible and swear. They wanted to affirm, and they had that privilege. And finally, financial support for the passage from Hamburg to Fort Garry of $30 per adult, $15 per child under 8, and $3 per infant. So essentially those were the main points of the Privilegium, as they called it, the privileges. It seems that the Mennonites who chose to settle in Manitoba did so in part because, as one of their elders put it, it is, Manitoba that is, it is under the protection of the Queen of England, and therefore we believe that the principle of non-resistance, the idea that one did not have to serve in the military, will be maintained there for a longer period of time, and also that the school and the church will be under our own administration. Mennonites had been used to making negotiating privileges with rulers, not democracies. Rulers could promise things, and it was more or less up to them to keep them. Mennonites who came to Manitoba in the 1870s were clearly a desirable group to further the project of what John Weaver has called the Great Land Rush of the 19th century. Didn't only happen in Canada, happened in Australia, happened in New Zealand. And Weaver chronicles the alienation of Indigenous land, the violation of their notions of land tenure, and the substitution of British notions of property that says you can put a 1-by-1 iron bar in the ground and proclaim an imaginary line that gives you property rights and allows you to determine what happens inside the boundary. Although the 1873 Mennonite migrants were European and viewed as desirable settlers, their conception of, quote, who owns the land were also not aligned with the ideas of the Dominion of Canada. The Dominion Lands Act was based on this notion of British land ownership. A survey was required to divide the land into discrete parcels, usually without any regard to natural features. The river lot system of Manitoba was a bit of an exception. The sense of, quote, improvement was inherent in justifying the takeover of what had been Indigenous space and place. It was embodied in the requirement that a 160-acre parcel of land had to be proved up before ownership was transferred to the settler. Mennonites in Russia had been granted lands by Catherine the Great to establish colonies. Land was granted to individuals, villages had reserve lands to allow population growth, and colonies had reserve lands set aside for future villages. Within a colony, land was kind of owned by an individual and could be sold. The colony system provided for some sense of communal holding of land. Outsiders, that is non-Mennonites, could not purchase the land, and the allotment of land in a village allowed for some sense of balance and equality and proximity for each Mennonite family. The relentless march of capitalist agriculture and market economies, along with dramatic population growth in the 19th century, meant that the communal aspects of this system had been severely tested by the 1870s. The Russian imperial government had intervened a number of times to essentially force land reform upon Mennonites, and a system of funding more land acquisition had to be put in place to deal with population increase. While the communal aspect of land tenure by Mennonites in Russia had been severely tested by the 1870s, Mennonites who chose Manitoba sought to preserve some sense of a communal system of land tenure when they came to this province. That desire was accommodated by them securing another privilege, not documented in the original agreement, not on those pages you see there, but significant. It was, you could say, on the ground, quite literally on the ground. Mennonites were granted the hamlet privilege, a privilege that allowed them to acquire individual ownership of a homestead without actually living on it, an apparent violation of the Dominion Lands Act. As long as a Mennonite homesteading family had built a house and barn and broken up some of their village allotment of land, they received title to their homestead, even if it was unoccupied and unimproved. They in turn might well live in a village where legal title to their property belonged to one of their neighbors. The relentless march of capitalist agriculture proved to be the undoing of this attempt at preserving some sense of communal land tenure. By the mid-1880s, some villages were breaking up, with Mennonite farm families moving onto the homestead lands that bore their names legally. Certainly, many Mennonites embraced the advance of capitalist agriculture. But the more conservative Mennonites came to feel that the promises made to them by the state were not kept. The nativism that came to the fore as a result of World War I and the attempts at assimilating them through the school system were probably the main causes of their disenchantment with Canada. But they had also come to realize that the trend to individualism implied in the market economy was destroying their sense of being a Christian community. In the aftermath of World War I, provincial governments in Manitoba and Saskatchewan imposed English schools in Mennonite areas in a determined and deliberate attempt to assimilate them. In southern Manitoba school districts, southern Manitoba school districts were often named after famous British military institutions, famous military bases in England. And in the 1920s, conservative Mennonites in southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan attempted to sell their lands in a single block, or in a single block in Saskatchewan and a single block in Manitoba, and to distribute the process equally among their members. While that goal was not achieved, some 3,000 Mennonites abandoned Manitoba in the 1920s and moved to Mexico. Some reflections. In Manitoba, there were few direct conflicts between Mennonites and Indigenous peoples over land. As Gerard Entz discussed in a presentation in Steinbeck a year or two ago, there were some Métis that had claimed land in what became the East Reserve, but the conflict seems to have arisen from federal government confusion and ineptitude to some extent, rather than anything Mennonites did or even knew about. In Saskatchewan, a portion of the young Chippewan Indian Reserve was taken from them and used to increase Mennonite reserve lands near Laird, Saskatchewan. There has been ongoing conversation between Mennonites and Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan about this story. 2, the land chosen by Mennonites in the 1870s was not the best land. It is true that today the land in what became the East and West Reserve is some of the most expensive and productive land in the province. But to a large extent, it is the rise of special crops and intensive animal agriculture that have made it so, later developments. In 1874, the East Reserve was poorly drained and rocky, and the Mennonites who settled on the West Reserve were the object of speculation as to whether they would succeed, in that they were the first Europeans to settle on land that was not near wood and water. The Mennonites of the 1870s chose Manitoba for religious, and one could say political reasons, not primarily because of the quality of the land. We do have to acknowledge that the notion of improvement is deeply embedded in Mennonite culture. Our people have a long history of modifying the created landscape to, quote, improve it, make it more productive. Where our ancestors, the descendants of the Dutch, North German, Prussian Mennonites came from in the Vistula Delta, there is no natural land. It has all been created by diking, draining, and otherwise modifying the natural landscape. We have a deeply embedded sense of improvement. If somebody is using the land and not improving it, is it really theirs? I mean, I'm just sort of saying, that's a deeply embedded cultural notion. Mennonites became participants in the alienation of land from Indigenous peoples and the ongoing breach of promises made to them. Although we may have initially had some connection to a notion that land tenure was communal and involved sharing God's creation, we very quickly embraced the march to British notions of property and property rights. Almost finally, as a historian and hence a storyteller, I do embrace the value of telling each other's stories as an important step on the way to reconciliation. I do believe, however, there is a rising danger among us of thinking, and Niigaan has already alluded to this, of thinking, if not saying, that Indigenous people need to move on. To affect a sense of being reconciled does imply, ultimately, of being able to move on. But for this story, when that is not for us to decide. As Mennonites who now enjoy the benefits of, quote, owning the land, we need to listen, and listen again. A similar desire to pay whatever seems fair and then move on will likely also not result in reconciliation. Compensation in the form of money, while important, will by itself not lead to reconciliation. I do not know what the steps are that will be on the path of reconciling us with our Indigenous neighbors. In the case of the young Chippewan people and the Mennonites of Saskatchewan, it has meant celebrating together on sacred land, joining them in making a case to the federal government for land claim compensation, and listening to their story. It is not a finished story. My thoughts.
Niigaan and Hans, thank you. In a moment, I will be asking for your participation for us to make this a community and family event of conversation. And I also want to reiterate, Niigaan, your comment that Loretta and Peter should feel free at any point to answer, and that you might even call on them as ones who might speak. Yeah,
Not getting away with anything.
He's putting you on notice there, Loretta. Each of us have listened with our own set of ears and stories out of which we come and the narratives that we hold. Each has talked about ownership and fairness, but framed differently. Both have talked about unkept promises. Both have talked about the importance of family and stories, but we've just recently come from Thanksgiving, and many of us joke afterwards that around those tables we try to stay away from discussions of religion and politics. So what does it mean to be family, as Niigaan has called us to think about families that talk about what's real, to talk about what's meaningful about our lives together and the bonds that we have with each other? That we are all treaty people, and that treaty produces family. When Murray Sinclair was here, he said, well, we went and asked the Europeans what we should do, and we asked them, would you take them back? And Europe said no. So here we are together as treaty people, trying to figure out, because here is our place of home. So in light of that, those thoughts, I encourage you to come to the mic here. And there's also a couple of mics in the back with Terry and Carl, so you can wave your hand if you would like a mic from one of them, or come forward. Please say your name. Please, given how many people are here, make your question concise so that we can have as much conversation as possible.
I just want to say one thing. Before,
Yep.
I don't want to forget it, but Hans, I wanted to just recognize some of the really important things that you contributed, and maybe if anyone's got a question, you can start heading to the mic, because I won't be very long here. But I really like what you had to say about capitalism and particularly neoliberalism and globalism, which is my latest kind of work that I've been working on, and that the neoliberal model of individual property is really one of the biggest enemies, not just to Indigenous peoples, but I like how you framed it in terms of it fundamentally changed Mennonites' relationships with each other. And that is not worth dropping. That is something that's really crucial to understand, that from World War II onwards, the rise of the nation state ideal has been considered to be the normal, right? The sense of individual property, to the point where Donald Trump goes to the United Nations and says, oh, the only thing we really care about is just leave us alone. Let us do our own thing. We don't really care about you. Indigenous peoples fundamentally cannot work that way within our traditions, our languages, our ceremonies. It is of crucial nature within our very self. I'll tell you one story. So, 'cause I don't see people going to the mics, so I'll tell you one quick story. So we do a lot of marching in our community. And my daughter says to me, we need to go to the march today. And I said, oh, come on, we got to go today. There's literally a march, 4 marches this weekend. Like, can we, you know what I mean? And so she goes, yes, for sure, because it was the march for the totem pole heading to the Lumbee territory that was going to Standing Rock. Remember Standing Rock? Remember how everyone was worried about the pipeline that was going underneath the water? Well, it turns out it broke. So everything that was done was legitimate and important, and most importantly, peaceful in the process. And she says, the reason why we go to that march is her name is Niigaanwewidam. It means the light that dances off the water woman. That's what it means. It means the light that reflects off the water. That's her name. It was given by Dale Missiabit, who's in town here. And she says, Daddy, light doesn't dance off the water if there's oil in it. So let me tell you what that means. What that means is she doesn't go to the march because she's protesting anything. She is living. That is who she fundamentally is. She's not protesting, although, pipelines are certainly worth something protesting about, but she is going because it is literally her relative, the water. That is herself. She is also water manifested itself. It is her identity. And so that's why we march. We don't march because we're against anything. We march because we are about life. And we're not about just water for us, because last time I checked, we're not the only ones who drink water, right? Is that true? Do Mennonites drink water, Hans? Can you hear an expert? Can you tell me?
Yeah, they do drink water.
Right. My point of it is like it's often framed in terms of a protest, but really it's just about life. And what I love about your bringing in capitalism here is capitalism drives us apart, and fundamentally for those who don't come from traditions where individualism and capital and property are the fundamental tenets, we are under constant threat by a world that continues to move in that direction, in the McDonald's direction. And sorry to bring in the corporate, I don't know if they sponsored the event, Mandy, I don't know what's going on. So there's nobody coming to the mic, so I'm just going to keep going. Hans, you going to take over here?
No, I'm going to wait for somebody to come to the mic.
Okay, all right, perfect.
Hans, do you want to respond to anything Niigaan said? Can I let him do that?
Back now, so.
Okay.
It's a bit of a long story.
Your name, please.
I am half Mennonite, and as you can see, I'm not full Mennonite. My other side is Wet'suwet'en from BC, and so this is a really important puzzle piece kind of conversation that I'm really glad that I got to be here for. But I have a kind of political question for you. I'm a physiotherapist, and I recently began working for the Rehab Center for Children, providing service for children who live on reserve through the thankfully, finally appearing funding for Jordan's Principle. And so, a number of the people, most of the people who work for the Rehab Center for Children are not Indigenous, not Métis, not Inuit, not First Nations. And I wanted to get your perspective on the relationship of a professional coming into the community. And I'm so thankful we can finally come into the community instead of just drive by going to the next non-Indigenous community. But what's that relationship? What should that relationship look like? And how can we be culturally aware? How can I help my peers be culturally aware when we are at your doorstep?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think there's a couple questions in there, but I'll try to address the main one, which is how do we ultimately work with each other effectively, respectfully, right? And we have a long history of people coming to try to save us, and particularly save us from ourselves, our own savagery, right? And particularly because the fundamental tenet of that position is that Indigenous peoples can't help themselves. It's like the movie Avatar. Anybody see the movie Avatar? Indigenous peoples been on the planet for tens of thousands of years, but they need an American to come and save everybody. It's Dances with Wolves Part 2. And that story of saving is a fundamental problem, because it is the position where Indigenous peoples aren't human beings in that equation. They aren't human beings who are active agents within their own lives. And as Wendy said, which is actually my Uncle Jim's teaching, which is you should listen twice as much as you speak, or the Creator gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should act in the same way. We should act in terms of walking in and looking and trying to understand before we embody and impress and impose. And I think those are, that's probably the first thing. My father used to come in and, you remember the Aboriginal Dust Inquiry? I know that was a couple of years ago, but there's 1988 to 1990. Remember that? Well, my father used to go across the province to Indigenous communities, and he was an outsider for the generally most part. He was a Southerner, Indigenous person from Winnipeg, grew up St. Selkirk, fairly urban, especially when you're going up to Puckatawagan, right? And maybe been there once in his life, walks in, and he's with Justice Hamilton, right? Remember Justice Allen Hamilton, the late Justice Hamilton, amazing, wonderful uncle of mine. Justice Hamilton used to come to the front, and he wanted the things to start at 9 a.m. And he's the judge, right? And they're both judges. Dad's recently appointed to the bench. He's about 38 or whatever he is. And so Justice Hamilton comes to the front. He strikes his gavel and he says, "We are ready to begin." But there's Justice Sinclair sitting in the back having a donut, visiting with 3 grandmas. And meeting people. He ends up going outside, sitting with people, having a bologna sandwich out near the cars over there. Spends about an hour, and there's Justice Hamilton. You remember Justice Hamilton turning redder and redder to the point where he was like literally that color when they finally got started. And that is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is spending time. My father, just because he was Anishinaabe, didn't mean he was an insider to that community. He had to spend the time. And he had to spend the time getting to know people, the grandmas, and the time and the energy and the space and the geography and the politics. And he had to spend all that time. And that's what we all have to do when we spend time within communities. I tell my students that you won't, we do a master's, you're supposed to do a master's program in 2 years. I say, you're not going to finish in 2 years. If you're lucky, you can maybe write about a few thoughts and maybe get a master's degree. But when you enter a community, you're starting a lifelong journey with that community. And most important thing is that you always go back. You never leave them. Once they have offered you those gifts, you have a lifelong relationship with that community. Hope that answers a little bit of what you're talking about. And Jordan's Principle, those who don't know what Jordan's Principle is, it's the notion that because Indigenous peoples have treaties with the Crown, it's that if you need a service that's provided by the province, it used to be that before they would give you health care, they had to phone Ottawa to see if they can give it to you, which, as you can imagine, in an emergency situation for young children results in death, which is why a young man named Jordan died. That's why Jordan's Principle is that it doesn't matter if Indigenous peoples go to hospital, education, wherever, they have to be served just like any other citizen within the country. So, sorry, long answer. And thank you for the water.
Hey, my name's Cassidy, and my question is, I come from a generation that very much wants to see and to be able to create tangible change. But being white, we also come from this place of the white savior and someone who clearly, since we're white, we know how to come in and make the change regardless of what that means for the people we're trying to create the change for. So how do we kind of like wrestle with that and make the change that not only we want to see, but the people that we're trying to create the change for need to see?
Go ahead, Hans. It's your turn. No, I'm just joking.
Thank you.
I'm going to throw you because I think this question is actually for you. But what I would say is, like, I never knew Hans. I knew Wendy, right? And I've spent a lot of time with Wendy. Wendy's an amazing. I mean, the amount of work that she does, not just with students, but with Indigenous students, and the work that she does in her classes, I think is an epitome. She talked a little bit to Wendy, but I'll throw Hans because he has the mic, and I keep saying your name wrong. So it's like people try saying Niigaanwewidam. So there you go. So, but you know what? I think what Hans did tonight was incredibly brave. And I want to commend you as a relative and as a brother to say the work that you did tonight was really important, because it's hard to talk about land theft. And it's hard to talk about genocide. And at times we need to have those hard conversations, because for me, that's that brave Tim Hortons conversation that our sisters have, our aunties have, and those brave conversations that my other students have on every day. And a lot of my students are non-Indigenous. And I say that your job is to be brave now, because you can't unknow what you know. And so go ahead, Hans, you're going to say something.
I was just going to add, with reference to Niigaan, I said to somebody I was appropriately anxious about today, translation terrified. It's a really difficult subject, and it's hard to know about patience. I mean, I understand the impatience. Let's do it. And I've sometimes said to my students in my Canadian history classes, if 30 years from now, 50 years from now, historians said, boy, when you were the Prime Minister, things really began to change. Whatever that would be, eh? What is it you would do? Well, it's a hard question, right? There are no easy answers here. I mean, I think as Niigaan has said, I mean, they're really about the future, because we're not going to undo a whole bunch of the past just like that. But I mean, I think it is important for us to tell the stories, to listen to them really carefully, and allow things to grow. It sometimes takes a while. I know it's not a good answer.
The solution is make my daughter the Prime Minister. It happened tonight.
Yeah.
It literally happened. Is everybody aware of that? I don't know. No, but
Yeah,
I mean...
I know, it's hard. It's hard to say, you know, well, this will take some time. Niigaan doesn't want it to take time. Neither does his daughter.
There's fundamental things that need to happen to deal with what are egregious emergency situations. And one of the bravest things that I've seen within my lifetime, I never thought I'd ever see, is during Idle No More, everybody started having real conversations. And not everybody, I mean, a lot of people started by young people to say, what does it mean to be a treaty person? What does it mean to have 1,200 murdered missing Indigenous women, just that we know about, never mind the thousands of others that we don't know about, or the thousands of Indigenous men that have gone missing, or tainted water, or moldy houses, or et cetera. And that conversation was in our community. And what I began to see on the United Churches and other churches within the city was Shoal Lake 40, and we talked about it tonight. And the fact that water within Winnipeg that we're all drinking even tonight is stolen water. It is stolen water that people have, and if you read Adele Perry's work at the University of Manitoba, a colleague of mine, she documents with deft precision and evidence you cannot argue with that Winnipeg participated in an incredible genocide to that community and participated in such a way that the entire city is really here because of Shoal Lake 40. And that's a hard conversation to have. And at the end, and should we be having that conversation? Yes. Should we be having it today? Yes. And then what do? Then we say, well, 99.9% of the land, most of it has been taken illegally. Most of it has been taken through what we call theft, or in my case of my community, ethnic cleansing, but we call it progress in the history books. So, you know, in Selkirk, where we were forcibly removed in 1907, I can just keep going. And it's hard to hear that. I know. It's depressing too. But when I'm doing it, I really am coming from a place of love. I'm doing it because I love this place so much. Like, I'm a Manitoban. I'm made from this place. Norway House, St. Peter's, Peguis First Nation, but I also come from my mother, who is a Gamache from the Pas, who emigrated here from France. My grandfather is a Warren who came from Britain and settled in Regina. I am literally the most Manitoban you can get. I am made from this place, and it's because I love this place so much that I talk about such harsh things, because I want us to move quickly. But as my father said, it took us 150 years to get here. It's not going to take one evening class or a course to change that, but that is a step.
Yes. It certainly is.
Bravery and courage, and it takes courage to ask a question, so Miigwech.
Thank you.
Just race to the mic. Fight over the mic.
My name's
now
Gareth
we're seeing
Neufeld.
it.
I don't have a big question. I just want to share when patience gets advised. I recall a lecture I heard many years ago from a guy from Berkeley, a smart guy, like you. And he talked about patience and persistence. And that culture shift happens when there's a perfect balance between patience and persistence. If there's too much patience, nothing changes, or at least not fast enough. If there's too much persistence, it gets pushed in a way that people can't actually allow the roots for it to take hold. So that's always been a helpful thing for me when one considers finding a way of being part of a shift in culture.
That is a good thought, and certainly when I counsel patients to some extent, I mean, I do worry about a sense that, all right, let's just get over with this. Like, we're done with this. Like, we've heard this enough. We're finished, you know. Then I say we counsel patience, because we're not done, and we shouldn't be done in that sense, you know. So it's a good comment, though.
I was invited to speak to, I did 1,400 Catholics in one day. I think that's a record for me.
Lot, yeah.
1,400 Catholics in one room. That's like the start of a joke or something. But anyways, so, and then Niigaan walks in. No, anyways. But you know, I did 1,400 Catholics, teachers out in Regina. And the first thing I said to them is, I know it's hard to hear it, but you guys got to get your house in order. Because there's a lot of things happening in the Catholic Church that really delegitimizes any position to tell anyone else what to do. And I say that lovingly. I say that with a grandmother who was Catholic till the day she died. I was there. I got the holy water put on me. I respect it. But I also say you got a lot of work to figure out your own house. And I say that kindly because many Indigenous peoples have deep admiration and affinity and relationships with the Catholic Church. And so the work that is important is those hard conversations is the first step. But that brave, once you know it, then you take action, which is why paralysis, the third P I would add in that, is tempting because you think you don't want to do more damage. But I say taking the brave step of once that patience begins, your paralysis falls away. And you can take the brave step of knowing that you know injustice when you see it. What I've said recently in, this is shameless self-promotion, right? But in my column about urban reserves, it is so horrendously stupid and ignorant to call $65,000 as a tax exemption to the urban reserve within the city that's going to exponentially create millions of dollars of investment within the city, not consider that an investment, and then write off $115 million for a stadium. Like, who's really the issue here, and where should the attention be? It's not $65,000. Urban reserves are the most brilliant win-win situation for everyone. They are an exponential investment in any area, and the proven cases in Saskatchewan where 50-plus urban reserves have saved towns, have saved communities within Saskatchewan, and our investments within Manitoba. They are a win-win for everybody because they escape the chains of the Indian Act and support property development and even commercial development within cities, and et cetera, et cetera. So getting out of paralysis and seeing sometimes contemporary fear coming from a long history of division, stereotypes, misreadings, ignorance, but that moving beyond that to say, you'll move and you'll say, hey, that's not an exemption, that's an investment. That is a huge investment in the city of Winnipeg, and it's incredibly brave for our leaders to think in that fashion, particularly when we're writing off big, loans that we're giving elsewhere. But even for the mere fact that it shows a lot of bravery. It moves us beyond paralysis into action. And that happens within government or the voting booth or even in a march. All of that motion.
Mm-hmm. There was someone who, there we go.
My name is Richard Penner. I'm from Alberta. I understand we're talking a lot about treaties here. I understand that the situation in British Columbia was different, that there are very few or no treaties there at all. How is the situation there different from here, if there is a difference?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think it's a question that a lot of people have about why is there a modern treaty process in BC? And there's many answers to it, and there's a few lawyers here in the room who can probably pipe in, but what I would say is the predominant reason is because British law, based on the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the King said, everything is mine, and he said, everything is mine up to the Rocky Mountains. And then when Canada makes that law, then there is a kind of a weird space that BC is in, because there is already existent pre-Confederation treaties in that space, but there's also a kind of a complexity within British Columbia involving having learned from the treaty process being so faulty and being so exploitative, because it turns out Indigenous people talk. Like, for instance, Treaty 1 and 2, there was a negotiation for $3 a year. It wasn't meant to be $3 a year forever. Back in 1871, that $3 a year was a decent amount of money. You could support yourself. $3 a year today gets you not even a latte, nothing over there is $3, I bet.
Right.
That's not what the treaty was meant to be, $3, but it turns out Treaty 3, Indigenous peoples had known and realized what was happening, and they said, no, we want $5. And turns out Indigenous people talk. So by the time BC rolls around, there is a suspicion involving treaties. And so like I said, there's a number of factors. One is the Royal Proclamation. Another one is suspicion. Another one is Indigenous peoples operate culturally differently in British Columbia in terms of the relationship between land and particularly property. And so, there's a very specificity in that place. But generally, the Royal Proclamation, I encourage you to look towards that of why the modern treaty process is. But, literally, you go to BC, first thing you ever hear is you are on unceded land, which is very different than here where we say we are on treaty land. So I go out to BC, my PhD's from UBC, and I was like, hey man, treaties are cool, treaties are about family, treaties are all together, and people in BC are like, treaties are genocide. Treaty is a dirty word around here. Because treaties often mean the end of things, and for many Indigenous nations out there, they see treaties as an assimilative document, right, an assimilative tool. And so it's a very different relationship. So if you go out there and you say, hey man, I'm a Treaty 1 person, it might not be so favorable in BC that it would be out here.
Yeah, these are my people.
Hi, my name is Matthew Neufeld, and thank you both speakers for sharing and for being honest. And I really appreciate Dr. Sinclair saying you're speaking from love and from the heart. And I think some of the things that I'm reading and thinking about, these are very difficult because we see things differently, and some of us are constituted, I think, in ways that it's very difficult to see from another perspective. And what does help is to make, or I think what at least would help, often helps me, is to have an acknowledgement that even if the critique is hard to hear, that the person is speaking it because the person is seeking the good of the whole. And so thank you for that. So I said my name is Neufeld, but I'm not Mennonite. I'm Presbyterian. So I say that just to sort of complicate this idea of kinship, which I'm sort of getting, or peoplehood. My ancestors came and settled in 1893 in what was then the West Reserve, but I'm not Mennonite. I'm Presbyterian. I'm also a British historian, and so I have an observation that has a question in it, and then I have a question. And the observation is from Dr. Sinclair's reflection, and that is that what I heard was treaty described as a kind of cosmology and also as a political metaphor. A metaphor for a way of people living together in a kind of polity. And I heard that described as a family, and I also heard it described as something that has citizens. And I'm not sure how to reconcile a polity where the base relation is family, but also has citizens. Because families, in a European tradition, families or households are institutions with very defined roles. And people know where they fit in a family. And I'm not sure, from what I heard, what the roles would be, although perhaps there's some gesturing to this in language about settler or about guests and hosts. So I'm not sure how that, I just raised that as an observation as to how that might be complicated in the future. Perhaps what we need to imagine is a new kind of family, a new kind of polity. Then the question, and I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but can we have patience for people who are, say, committed to capitalism? Perhaps a capitalism that's transformed, but a capitalism nonetheless that is the basis for the creation of value. Because the other side of my family fled a regime that said capitalism is evil. That was in 1917, 1918, and then 1922, 1923.
I'll deal with the citizen family thing quick and jump in, Hans, if you're... And also, I want to encourage, don't shy away. I see you hiding in the back, Peter. I see you hiding in there. So he's like, you're on your own, is what he's saying. Okay, so as I go back to what I said before about treaties as being vessels of family making, and the most important thing to understand about treaties is while they are obviously contemporarily framed in the notion of title and ownership and land, and it is in the notion of relationship where treaties reside for Indigenous people. And there, as Jamie Wilson used to remind me, there are two parties to the treaty, so I can't just deny that Canada viewed treaties as land purchases for the most part. So I can't deny that. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to reconcile those things. But the term citizen is a way in which we reconcile those things. And for us, family is a flexible mechanism that is inherently political. And it is always, everything I said in my opening prayer is political. It is about my relationships with all these different beings, human and non, that I bring to the table, which is what represents me, what creates me. We are adopted by and adopt non-humans, non-Indigenous people all the time in our families. And you do so too. How many of you have an animal as a part of your family? Yeah, exactly, right? Is it a dog or a cat, right? Or a hairless guinea pig, how my family used to have. Yes, I said it. But my point is our families are such in the way that when a relationship is formed, our families were exponentially growing all the time, and our leadership was diffuse. The chief and council system doesn't work for us. It's an imposed system because in our communities, an Ogamak, a chief, we would have multiple chiefs. We have a drum chief, water chief, fire chief, storytelling chief. We'd have a clan chief, youth chief, women's chief, grandmother chief, and so on. You go to a community, there'd be 1,000 chiefs. And embodied within the round dance system, we would have a constant series of shared leadership. We made it work. And some people have said, well, that's socialism. No, it's not. That's indigeneity, or Anishinaabeness. We made our system work according to our clans, and that's what made a sense of citizen and family to be connected. Our sense of our family network is not based on a nuclear model. In fact, for many of us, we would have multiple parents in our lives. The most important person is a young Anishinaabe Anine, which is a young Anishinaabe man. The most important person is not my father, it is my uncle. My uncle is the one who takes me on my first vision quest. My uncle is the one who takes care of me and teaches me and initiates me into the world. And my uncle is the one who teaches me about how to take care of my body and how to make a fire and how to hunt, or particularly how to share my gifts with the world. My point of telling you all of that is our governance system comes out of that notion of kinship, and it inherently comes with a political slant to it. Sorry, there you are right there. So that sense of citizenry is inherently a sense of our kinship models. And so there's a bridge there that I just comment on that I see citizen and family as being innately connected. And maybe that's worth fleshing out a bit more, and I hope I addressed it in some way. But your second point, which is about being patient with capitalism, I completely agree, and I would encourage you to read the work of my colleague Wanda Watney at the Department of Native Studies. She works a lot with business, right? But it is hard to look at evidence such as Nietzsche Commons, which was a capitalist enterprise that tried a model outside of the notion of capitalism, meaning it committed itself to community, and to see the forces of global neoliberal capitalism come in and crush a vision of community for the sake of profit, and we all watched that happen, and we let it happen. We all went, here's a business that is committing itself to growth, economic enterprise, and most importantly, community. It invested itself in community, and it also offered relationships within that community that wasn't based on profit and exploitation, what was based on building people up. And we all just let that happen. We just all let that, that's on all of us. Thunderbird House, the same thing. North End Family Center, same thing. Indian Métis Friendship Center in the North End, same thing. Neoliberalism, capitalism, I'm running out of patience. And the more important thing, the world is running out of patience. We got 12 years. We got 12 years of Trumpian economics that is on all of us. And we may not have voted, but we are certainly inheriting it. And when we inherit that, what are we going to do now about it, right? How are we going to deal, and how much patience can we have in a world in which I know capitalism's not going away. I'm not an idealist, or I live in a utopia, like someone accused me of one time. I'm very much a realist. Every time that we think, people say, well, you keep arguing against pipelines. I'm saying, how about we have a conversation about what it means to have in a world without pipelines? Like, let's have a real hard conversation of what that looks like. Let's not be afraid of that. And that may mean we have to all give a little bit. We have to, and that's what families do, isn't it? Isn't families about compromise? Not about one or two people getting all the goods, getting 99.9% of the house, making sure that the other 0.1% live in massive, overwhelming poverty, tainted water, moldy houses, etc.
If I can just make a little comment, my sort of comments about capitalism are observational. It just seems to me that is what happened. It offers us an explanation without, I'm not as edgy as Niigaanwewidam is about capitalism, but it is an explanation, and certainly capitalism is prevalent in the whole notion of the transfer of Mennonite notions of communal land tenure is clearly explained by market economies and capitalism, I think.
We have just a few minutes left, so just again, encouragement, keeping those questions succinct.
I'm just in time. Okay. My name is Marshall Murdoch, and I'm from Treaty 5, Fisher River, Manitoba. And I'm glad to be here, and I want to say a couple things. I think end of the day, end of the session, honestly, it's good to see that we're getting together and talking about these things. We need to talk. We need to build bridges of understanding. We need to work together. We have to live in this world together. But I think end of the day, honestly, all we ask as Indigenous people is we're looking for justice. We can talk about the schools, the scoopers, Six to Scoop. We can talk about Jordan's principle. I made a list of things here. Questions why we have 80% of our people in jails. There's something wrong with that picture. We need justice. We want justice. But we want to work with you. I look around here and I see a lot of elderly people. We're all the young people. And let's do another session, but have a larger panel of different perspectives. End of the day, again, we want justice. That's all we ask for, nothing else. And the Mennonite people are friends of mine. I have two sister-in-laws who are Mennonite, from Winkler and from McGregor. And my understanding is it's a strong Christian community. And if I'm reading the Bible right, God is a God of love, of mercy, but also God of justice. We want justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I was just going to call you up. I hope you're not going back there to get a coffee.
He's running away.
Yeah, he's running away. The reason, Niigaanwewidam, of course, wanted to call him up. The reason I was going to also call him up is for the last 10 years, our out-of-town program and Rosso River have been trying to do friendship together, so would be interested to hear some thoughts from you on that, or whatever else is on your heart. He'll find his way.
Do you want the? You want
here,
right there?
I think here.
Bonjour. Say bonjour. That's bonjour is part of Wenabajou. Wenabajou was the original man, very first man that set foot on Turtle Island. And so we say Wenabajou, Boujou. Boujou means you're my relative. Boujou, you're my relative. So I want to talk a little bit about the treaties. The reason treaties are legally binding is because of consultation and consent. That's what makes them legally binding. It's not Canadian law. It's consultation and consent. We were consulted. Our clan mothers were satisfied with the content, 3 main articles, education, health, and shelter. They were satisfied. The Queen said, "We will pay for this. We will pay for your health, your education, and your shelter. We will pay for that." We had no idea what they were talking about. So, but then the clan mothers realized that it was a good deal, and so they instructed the clan leaders. I never call them chiefs. Chiefs is a derogatory term. I call them Niigaanwewidam, the ones that lead. And the clan mothers told the clan leaders to sign off on that document. And that's what they did. You don't read that in a Canadian text or anywhere. This is told to me by my elders, who went without their thoughts being or their thoughts, I guess, being heard. And so I'm standing here, telling you what they said in that. So. The reason when Niigaan said something to the effect of the Indians, we're not Indians, by the way. We're Anishinabek. We're not Indian. The reason I lost my train of thought here, but. We want everything for free, it said. We want everything for free. That's not true. That's not true. As a matter of fact, it's the other way around. You want everything for free. And you got to hear this. You have to hear this. You may not like it, but you have to hear it, because it's the truth. You want everything, like you're living here for free. What the Queen promised, she would pay for these 3 main articles of treaty, never happened. Never happened. So actually, you're living here for free. And I'm saying that not in anger. I'm saying that in knowledge that we've come up with to determine where we're at. So you're living here for free. You haven't paid anything towards the treaties. Nothing. So, in saying that, though, now that you know, do something about it. Don't sit back there and not do anything. Do something about it. I've met with some people from New Bergthal. Loretta was there, and we had a meeting with them, several meetings actually, and we did a little exercise there, by which Ray Ham, he gave me the first $3, $3 of treaty money, and I told him these $3 there. And there were some other people that came up, and they gave their money too. They come up with $11. And so they did something about it. They did something about it. You see, we're supposed to be the richest people in the land, but we're not. Because the treaties were not being honored, we're not being paid, and that's so. I want to tell you that, and not in anger. Not in anger. I don't tell you that in anger. I tell you that, and so that you're now that you know, do something about it. Do something about it. Okay, miigwech.
Nope.
Thank you.
I want to just add to what Peter was saying about family and community. One of the most important teachings that I've ever gotten was kind of in an odd place at an odd time, and it was in the middle of Idle No More, and I was doing like 5 gigs a day, and I was driving all over the place, and I was doing all of these things, and I was really exhausted. And I was invited to a gig to a talk at Providence College. Yeah, you guys know Autoburn, right? So I rushed there, and I got there literally 2 minutes, ran on stage, did my talk, and I did a lot of the things, what I talked about tonight, a lot of things Peter was talking about, which is about family and about community. What does it mean now that we know things? And what it means is that when you see the march, it's not people protesting, it's people living. And that you are a part of that life. You are invited to that. You are part of this relationship. And now doing something involves not just $11, that's pretty good, that's pretty cheap by the way, but also engaging yourself and becoming critical on the issues. And of course, as I completely agree with my brother that came up to the microphone, do your own reading. Just because I say something or Hans says something, Hans is a pretty smart guy, but go and read your own stuff and become critically aware. Read treaties, read amazing work by Tom King and et cetera, et cetera. Catch up on those things. And then take that work and put it into your own life and bring it into your living rooms and your boardrooms and the voting booth and your workplace and bring it into those places. Be brave. And so I said all those things at Autoburn at Providence College, and I had a guy who came up right following me, and his name was Harley Eagle. Does anyone know that guy? Yeah? He works at the Mennonite Central Committee. Used to? And now he's in BC, but he was in Manitoba for a short while. Anyways, he came up and he said, you know, everything Niigaan said, I agree with, and here's where the Bible said it too. And then he quoted scripture from the Bible about family, about relationship, about the story of Jesus coming, I'm not a biblical expert, but coming into now, hearing the stones singing. And I'm like, that's the most Anishinaabe story I've ever heard in my life, is the stones sing. Like, that's the sweat lodge. and so there's many things that bridge us and that bring us together, and we need to see those things. And oftentimes, historically, it hasn't been the Christianity that's been the problem, it's sometimes been the Christians. And that the teaching of Christianity is those teachings of those fierce love. And that kind of love that I come with tonight comes also from many of the Christians that I met, including my grandmother, who just passed away, 97 years old, and was a faith believer in her entire life. And that is as much a part of me as anything else. And while I am a Medewin, I also recognize that she had a lot of teachings too that she gave me. And each one of us picking up this work and offering it to each other is what Peter's talking about. Be brave. Be different than the stories that you've inherited. Be different than the society and the power relationships that have fundamentally created all of us and divided us. That is what bravery and courage is defined by, is about your ability to overcome that and to step up and be more and to be, the part of this thing that we are all a part of.
I'm looking to Loretta to see if her name's been uttered a number of times, so I wanted to check in also with you if you had some words that you'd like to share here.
I'm good.
Thank you. I'm not going to talk for very long. This has been an extremely enlightening evening, and I want to thank both speakers for sharing their knowledge and their personal stories as well with us. At the Treaty Relations Commission, this is our job, to go and to talk about the treaties and the treaty relationship and what that's all about. And for a large part of that is taking the treaties to the classrooms and teaching the young people, the future generation, about these relationships. And we use the word as well, relationships, relations between each other, right, as human beings, as Anishinaabe people. And a large part of what we do at the Commission is that. And when we look around the room, you know, we're of an older generation here. Certainly, I'm older than Niigaan, and some of you are older than I am. And so going back to school is a little bit late for that, and you don't have the benefit of that. And we have these wonderful opportunities like this to learn and engage. And I know some of the young people are anxious and they say, what can we do, right? Some of the things is to take the time to learn about each other, how we look at each other, right? What I see when I look at you, and what do you see when you look at me? Because as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, we don't all look alike. Even between Niigaan and myself, other than he's got black hair, I've got a little bit more gray hair than he does. But you know, we're not one homogenous group. We have, even amongst ourselves, different histories, different exposures to the outside world or non-First Nations communities. But we have to take the time to really understand, and we're kind of becoming aware of some of these issues. Right? The work of Justice Senator Sinclair and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has opened our eyes in terms of what the history is between First Nations and non-First Nations people. And Niigaan referred to that. We can't unknow that. We can't unsee what we've been shown. We have to go forward and we have to learn some more. And some of that is a very hard reality to see. People cannot believe some of this history about First Nations people. But the treaties, when we talk about the treaties were about coexisting as well, as between human beings, as between Anishinaabe people, right? It was coexisting, it was respecting each other's cultures and language and histories and societies and ceremonies, not imposing as what happened, but it's really coexisting and learning how to share the space. And it's not one over the other. Nobody has the answers. We've tried that. Right? It's been tried that someone has imposed and had tried to direct First Nations people on how to live. We can't do that anymore. And that's where some of the patience was talked about earlier. But there's obligations. Treaties are obligations as well. So there's obligations on you as a treaty partner to understand what that relationship is all about. Once you start to become aware and you have that understanding of that relationship, then that action that's required to rectify that relationship, to have true reconciliation will happen, and it will take some time. But I want to thank you, and I certainly want to thank the presenters. I enjoyed my evening, and I look forward, as do others, I'm sure, to having more conversation, and I commend CMU for having this talk. It's a difficult talk, but I think it's a great start to something that we all need to hear and have more conversation about. So, miigwech. Wendy.
So some vivid images have been shared with us tonight. Niigaan, I think you were the first one that mentioned love, and you have said that word so generously. And I kind of quake each time I hear you say that here, just with the openness in which that word is offered. The image of family, but not without a call also for justice, to saying, what are you going to do now that you know? What does that mean for our work of reconciliation? So there's been messages for us to be brave, to see courage through, to take these words to heart. And as our youth have called, let's do some action as part of that. Let's do our own work of education and moving from here. Our intention, our hope is not to exhaust an issue, because that would mean we think that's done, but rather to say we need to keep on talking. I'm going to ask you to maybe, as your commitment, to read Niigaan's column every day, to just be informed, and to go online and see how people respond to him, so that you can support him with what sometimes gets said.
I don't read it,
online.
so someone.
I hear
I've
about
literally
it.
never read
I
a
hear
comment.
about it.
Not ever, but.
Tell your friend that you came with what your question would have been if you had the courage to come up and ask it. Let's talk, let's build bridges, investigate, think about what justice might be, and I'm going to ask you, as I often do in places, because we don't have maybe the ability to imagine singing stones, but I'm going to ask you to just breathe in the stories, take in what was offered, and let go of your fears and anxieties to act on those things. So please, before I do that, I want to say there are books over there. Niigaan is as marvelous a writer as he is speaker. There are books on numerous of the topics that have been mentioned here. And as we close, please help me honor our two speakers who have entered into a brave conversation here for what they have offered. Let's take the journey.
Thanks, Wendy.